Hey,
Hey, Bill.
how's it going?
What's going on, man?
The usual. Busy as heck.
So you teasing me with that elementals piece, huh?
Well, I was thinking, one of these days I'm going to need some props or something. And then when I was thinking about talking with you, I was like, this is probably the only time I'll be able to show these elementals pieces because, we might be, we're a select group of collectors that really like it. I think.
That actually know what it is.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So yeah, I thought, and they're so big anyway.
Yeah, I was gonna say that piece looks huge.
It is. It's probably I don't know, it's probably 14 by 22 around there.
Nice.
Yeah, yeah, hand up against it. So it's pretty big. Yeah, even that cover, that thing has got to be at least 24 by 36. I mean, I don't
It
know
looks.
why he works so big.
Yeah, that looks about the size of the issue number one cover. That was I saw that one in person. That was pretty huge.
Oh, I've never seen that.
Yeah, one of the dealers had it at one point. Might have been Albert or somebody, and I was like, wow. I don't know if I even got room for that.
Right, right. Yeah, there was what was the other cover I had that I don't have any longer? I think I had a Justice Machine cover that was done on pretty much the same size material. So maybe it was just like that's what they did.
Yeah, some artists just like to work big. I guess they feel more comfortable with that. Even going back to when pages were like twice up, I heard Kirby was very used to working big, and then when they went down to the 11 by 17 size, he actually had a hard time, trying to squeeze everything into smaller panels and stuff.
Right.
It's interesting because a lot of those guys lived not far from where I live now. Like Kirby lived on Long Island during the 60s, and I think his original house was like maybe 20, 30 minutes from where I live. So I was like, oh, that'd be kind of cool to see the old place. I'm sure it's like renovated by now and everything, but supposedly he worked in the basement of that house, just like a small room, smelled like cigars, and that's where he came up with, all the Fantastic Four stories and everything he worked on in like the early mid 60s.
Right. You though, it's like, how did you get started collecting original art? What was it? What started your bug, and which artists originally were you really looking for?
Well, to back up that question a little bit, because I was a little bit of a late bloomer with the original art.
Hmm.
It goes back to my comic book collecting, which I started reading comics when I was like 4 or 5 years old. I think like Justice League 100 was like my first comic book, and I couldn't even read very well back then, but I always got a kick out of the illustrations, the drawings, and I guess as you get older, maybe by the time I was like, I don't know, 7 or 8, I started to take notice of, oh, there's actually an artist's name on this or a writer's name, as opposed to, oh, this is just a Superman comic or a Spider-Man book. I think early on I started to notice the differences between different artists. Like, why does this book look really great and some of these other ones not as, exciting, explosive, whatever, adjective you want to use. So yeah, I started with the comics early, and at an early age, I wanted to become a comic book artist. That's what really drew me to the comics, to the art, and everything. That was always my lifelong goal to be a comic book artist. And I went to some early conventions. I would say for me, like when I was a teenager, my brother-in-law, who was 10 years older than me, he was the first one to bring me like to a comic book convention, probably around like '83. The Forbidden Planet comic book store in Manhattan used to have their own comic book conventions in Manhattan back in the '80s. So I went to a couple of those. I remember like Will Eisner was the guest at one of them. Jack Kirby was at a few of them, and that was probably my first exposure to comic book art. I really didn't pay much attention to it, uh, only because I had limited budget. I was 13, 14 years old. Most of my money went towards back issues. And I remember seeing comic book art at the shows. I distinctly remember like a John Byrne X-Men pinup. This had to be like in the early '80s. But I never crossed my mind to like collect it or anything like that. And then on Long Island, there was a comic book store I went to since '81 called Cosmic Comics, and they used to run a local comic book show in Rockville Center in a Holiday Inn. And each month they would have like a different comic book artist there. So the first one I recall meeting was Bill Willingham, oddly enough, who was drawing Elementals at the time for Comico. And that was my first comic book sketch back in '86. And even back then, I was never a kid that wanted like the main characters. You know, I wouldn't ask for like a Superman or Batman or anything like that. You know, I meet Bill Willingham. I was like, oh, can you draw me a Rat Man? You know, obscure villain that nobody probably even remembers to this day other than me and you. But, you know, that was my first sketch. And it was kind of interesting to me because I was into the art. I wanted to be an artist, seeing like, you know, do they use pencil? Do they use ink? Do they use pens? Do they use brushes? You know, what size paper? What thickness of paper? So all of that like really appealed to me. Like, how do they actually do this? Trying to like break it down in my head. You know, how can I, you know, learn this? How can I copy this to be an artist? And from there, I got a couple of sketches at future shows. I met Adam Hughes early on in his career. He was at a New York show. I think it was 1989. And that's the first time I met him. He did me a Captain America sketch. I think he was charging maybe $25 at the time for sketches. I remember getting one by Mike Zeck back in '89. He was at a show. And Bob Layton was another one I met early on. So for me, it was kind of cool to like connect a face with the names that we saw in the books, you know. And as far as like published art, I didn't really get into that until like 1998, 99, somewhere around there. You know, that was around the time that I logged on to eBay. And one day I was just like, oh, let me do a search. You know, one of the big artists that I grew up with was George Perez. During the mid 70s, it was all about Perez, John Byrne, Michael Golden, Frank Miller, Walt Simonson. So just randomly, I did a search on eBay under George Perez, and he was working on Avengers Volume 3 at the time in the late 90s. And I picked up a two-page splash off eBay, probably for like $200-300, and that made me fall down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, no. Well, that's around the time I started collecting too. Honestly, was that period. I think even probably the first original published art that I saw was probably that same kind of. I know I saw Perez artwork from Avengers Volume 3 as well. I didn't buy any, but because I think at that time I just was too scared to spend $200-300 on a piece of artwork, and you know ended up buying cheaper pieces, character designs, and I get a few sketches from artists myself. But
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, as far as the prices were concerned, I was always a collector, whether I was collecting comic books, vintage toys, then eventually that kind of evolved into comic art. And it seemed like with each collection, the prices of the items were going up. I mean, especially when you make that jump into comic art, you're going, you know, straight into like hundreds of dollars, eventually, you know, thousands of dollars. You know, they're big ticket items for sure. I mean, like I said, years ago, you could get sketches at cons, you know, for like $25, somewhere around there. And then what wound up happening was I didn't go to any conventions during the 90s. That's when I was married the first time. And during that whole period, I call that like my lost years, where I didn't go to any conventions. I was out of that whole realm of collecting and everything. And during that time period, like we were discussing earlier, a lot of creators started passing away. Um, it was during that time period. Jack Kirby passed away in the early 90s, John Buscema, Gil Kane. And these were all people that were like my artistic idols that I wanted to meet. You know, I grew up with their art. I loved, you know, how they drew stuff. And, you know, the fact that I could never meet these people again really bothered me. So around 2002, I started going back to conventions. That's around the time I was getting divorced. And from that point on, I made it a point that I was definitely going to meet any of the old timers that I really looked up to. The John Romita seniors, the Gene Colans, Sal Buscema, anybody that was still around. So that was like a big goal with going back to the conventions and trying to get sketches from them. Someone mentioned to me the idea in the early 2000s of starting a sketchbook. So I started like a small Captain America sketchbook with just like headshots. And the thing that blows me away now, I started that book around 2002, and I flipped through the pages now. I still have a couple of pages left in there for sketches, but just flipping through the book, there's so many artists that aren't with us anymore that are represented in that book. It's not just about the art; it's about the experience of having met them, talked with them, gotten to know a little bit about them. You know, it just blows my mind how time passes so quickly, especially when you're collecting, especially when you go into shows. Um, like you mentioned, a lot of our friends aren't with us anymore, whether it's collectors, creative people. Um, so yeah, having art by these people really means a lot to me. That I did get to meet them, and I did get to see something that their hands produced. I have a weird habit of when I'm at a convention and an artist is doing a sketch for me, not only do I photograph them drawing it, but sometimes I'll like zoom in on like their hand with the pencil in it, drawing the sketch. It just really personalizes it to me, that all that talent. I know it's in more than just their hand, it's in their eyes, it's in their mind, the way they create, the way they see things. But, just to see that produced from someone's hand, just blows me away even to this day.
So is Captain America a favorite character of yours? Is that why you have just that one sketchbook? Because I know you have a calf gallery dedicated to the sketches in that sketchbook.
Yeah, I mean, that was the first one I started. I mean, he appealed to me as a little kid. I think I was in like a barber shop in Brooklyn where I lived as a kid, and they had like ripped up comics sitting on one of the tables, with the covers torn off or whatever. And that was like my first time seeing like a Kirby Captain America drawing. And I don't know, as a kid, I was like, wow, that's different. He's got like a letter on his mask, as opposed to like Batman or Flash or whoever, So for some reason, I don't know, maybe I was learning my alphabet at the time, maybe I was like 5 years old or whatever. But I always thought it was cool. He had an A on his mask, and for some reason, Hawkeye appealed to me. He had an H on his mask, you know. So those were two of my favorites as a kid, and then that kind of segued me into reading Avengers. So that became like a favorite book of mine, even to this day. Um, like I said, I was never a huge fan of like the main characters, like Superman, Batman, Spider-Man. They're great characters. They've had great stories. They've had great artists. I appreciate their stories more for like the artwork and the stories, but as a character, I couldn't relate to a lot of them. I don't know. Captain America appealed to me. Maybe it was purely based on the costume. I don't know. It's just an early nostalgic memory type thing. But yeah, he was the first sketchbook I started. Soon after that, I started an Avenger sketchbook. Different characters, different artists in there. That one's still ongoing. And the kind of obscure one I started was Battle of the Planets, where that was an early Japanese animation that came out in Japan in 1972, and then came to America in '77 around the time Star Wars hit the U.S. So I guess the networks were looking for, oh, what kind of cartoon do we have that's similar to Star Wars? So they brought Battle of the Planets to the U.S., and that kind of blew me away because it was very different. The costumes were different. They were battling monsters instead of just supervillains. There was a sci-fi element in there. They had the spaceships, and it was in outer space. So I kind of like it because a lot of people don't know about it. I tend to veer away from things that are very like popular of the time. I kind of veer more towards obscure characters and shows type thing. That's always more interesting to me. So I started a sketchbook on that, and that's been going on about 10 years now. But the funny thing about getting sketches in that sketchbook is I have to be very particular who I ask because I notice it's a very generational brand, whereas I've asked some of the old time artists to draw it. They have no clue who the characters are. They just look at it like, oh, is this a Japanese cartoon? Like, what is this? Whereas I'll ask an artist that's closer to my age, if they're in like their late 30s to early 50s, they grew up during that. Even artists that I know from like Europe, Battle of the Planets was huge over there in like France, Spain, Italy. It was called something else, but they were all huge fans as kids. So I tend to get better commissions when the artists know those characters, as opposed to just asking somebody for like Captain America or some well-known character.
Right. Well, the Mark Brooks piece was pretty awesome.
I was kind of surprised with Mark because Mark's a little younger than me. He's like in his 30s, I guess, approaching 40s. And, I asked him, are you familiar with it? And I've seen he's done a few sketches of it that blew me away. And he was all charged to do it. So I can always tell, like, when an artist is really into doing a commission because, like, you'll go by their tables a couple of times and they're like, no, I want to add a little bit more to it, and you're almost like, oh, no, it looks fine. And like, no, I really want to put, all the bells and whistles on this,
Right. But, one of the cool, sets of stuff that you have in your gallery were those Just Go corner box pieces. So when I saw them, I was blown away.
Right.
But honestly, I just felt like there's just no way, I didn't know what Joe was going to do with them, and I didn't know who was going to buy them, but I knew they weren't going to last long. And you've got 4 of them. So, what was they just really appealed to you?
Well, the story behind that was, Joe originally did one for Conan, the Savage Sword of Conan corner box, where Conan's like holding the axe in front of him. And I saw that online. That like blew me away. And I emailed him like right away as soon as I saw that. I think the key in this hobby is like, as soon as you see something you like, whether it be an artist or a subject matter, like artists are accessible nowadays through Facebook or email or whatever, contact them as quickly as possible and, see, if you can work something out, see where they're heading with a project. So with that, I saw the Conan one. I emailed Joe, and he said, "Oh, I was like, did you ever give thought to doing some of the Marvel corner boxes?" Joe grew up with the characters in the '60s, so that was like his affinity for those ones. Those hit a nostalgic chord for him. For me, it was more like in the '70s and '80s, with the comics that I grew up with more. So I was like, did you give thought to doing more? He's like, oh, funny you should mention that. I'm going to be doing a whole series of these. So it was just, catching him at the right time. And, I worked out a deal with him. I was like, I would like to buy, a certain amount of the first few that you do as they're produced or whatever. And, he contacted me when he was working on the project. And he told me, right from the beginning, which ones he was going to be doing. I believe Spider-Man was the first one he did, which I also owned. So I had, other than Conan, I had bought the first 5 from him. And then Spider-Man was the only one that I let go of out of that batch. So it was Spider-Man, Captain America, Submariner, Doctor Strange. But yeah, that whole project really grew from there. Because I think early on, he had ideas of what he wanted to do with them. He was going to create like a poster for Marvel with them. He was going to sell them as prints at the show. And then at some point, I guess he spoke to an editor at Marvel and they were like, oh, let's do like a variant cover month with them. And it went from like maybe 10 at the time that he had painted to suddenly it was like 25, 30 that Marvel requested. So it kind of grew where originally he was just doing the early corner boxes. Marvel wanted him to do even like more current characters, like Deathlock and the Carol Danvers Captain Marvel, along those lines. In some cases, I think he had to actually create almost like corner box art, like the Thanos one. Thanos was never a corner box, but he took like a classic pose and made it into that. So I was very fortunate to work out a deal with him for those. And the only problem with that is, once you get a few of them, it's like, oh, I'd love to have the whole set. I think he was trying to be fair to everybody and offer them around. And because there were a few after the batch that I bought that just like blew me away. And I was like, oh, I'd love to have this one, or I'd love to have that one, but I think at some point you have to be happy with what you have and, just enjoy that.
Oh, I agree. Well, no, you did really well on the pieces that you've kept. I remember when Joe had I think posted about the Conan piece on Facebook. I was blown away and thought it was a great idea. And yeah, I thought that was one of the most memorable things he's done in the last few years. And now he's working on those. I think he's doing Edgar Rice Burroughs covers for certain things.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't wait to see all the work that's going to get produced from that.
Yeah, it was funny. Like, I didn't get into the painted art right away when I started collecting. It was always the pen and ink stuff. And at some point, well, I had his original Marvel Masterpiece cards when they came out in the early '90s, the first set that he did. So that was like my first exposure to his work. And from time to time at shows, I would see some of those. Not the ones I was looking for, but I'd see some of them. And at one point, I made a deal with one of the dealers for the Beast trading card art, and it blew me away seeing it in person because the colors are so much more vibrant. I mean, you can attest to this also with any color pieces you have. No scan is going to do it justice. You see the original person, the colors just pop right off the board. So yeah, that first piece of his, that kind of sent me in another direction of, I was collecting panel art up until that point, and I was like, oh, these would look nice, framed on a wall. I'm not big on framing like panel art. It's nice and all, and it's very nostalgic for me. But as far as, with limited wall space, I just want like, a painting, something colorful on the wall. So I started going in that direction at that point, but my collection's gone through so many different variations. People will ask me like, oh, what do you collect? Like they try to like label you as, oh, you're the golden collector, or you're the Battle of the Planets collector. And I try to tell them honestly, like my collecting tastes are all over the map. It could be based on an artist. It could be based on a nostalgic comic that I had as like a young kid, or it could be a brand new artist that, comes out of nowhere and I'm blown away by his art. So, art's very subjective as far as what we like, what we collect,
Oh, without question. Yeah, I was looking at your most viewed pieces in your collection, and it's the most viewed pieces that Alex Ross Battle of the Planets painting. So it's something that in doing some research on CAF for the interviews that I've done, it almost always seems like the color pieces and painted pieces end up being the most viewed in people's galleries. It's funny. I mean, it's just not what I would expect. You'd always expect maybe like the Adam Hughes pinup or something to be your number one viewed piece, or maybe it might be the most commented piece. But as far as like just eyeballs on the artwork,
Yeah.
mostly it's painted pieces.
Well, I think that's just from a visual standpoint. If somebody comes across your page and you got little thumbnails of each of your top pieces, the colors are going to draw the eye right in, as opposed to like a black and white piece.
Right. So you're a Godzilla fan too, I take it.
I've always liked Godzilla, as a kid. It was funny, they were kind of hokey back in the day as opposed to the more serious movies they're making nowadays. But, back in the day, Godzilla versus King Kong, and the two of them are throwing boxing punches at each other, guys in rubber suits, it was appealing as a kid. I liked it. The reason why I have the Alex Ross piece, one, I believe that's the only one he's done for Godzilla up until this point. Also, too, I'm a huge fan of Alex Ross's. I just got to meet him for the first time last year at New York Comic Con, and his prices do tend to be up there, as far as if you want like a major character or a lot of major characters on a piece. So I'll peruse his gallery on CAF, under Sal's page when he puts up new pieces he's selling for him. And I'll see like a Captain America painting or an Avenger painting, and I'll look at the price and I'm like, yeah, I can't really do that. So I figured if I was ever going to get any Alex Ross paintings, it had to be like lesser, more obscure characters, Godzilla, Battle of the Planets, where it's more affordable for me, as opposed to getting like a Batman or a Superman painting, which would be about 4 times the amount.
Right. No, well, that
But
was a good way to go.
yeah, the Godzilla, a friend of mine had it. He was shopping it around, and for like over a year, we tried to work out a deal on it, and finally it came to fruition. So yeah, sometimes you just got to be in the right place at the right time.
One of the most memorable pieces for me growing up, and I had it on my wall forever, was that Mary Marching Marvel
Right.
poster. I had that because I didn't even bag my comics. I had it kind of on a bookshelf, and that poster was taped to the wall with a bunch of Slurpee cups beside it. And, and I should find the pictures from those days because I like to take, I was like, whenever my stacks got to a really nice height, I'd take take a Polaroid of it.
Right.
But that poster was always in the background of it. I mean, I know you don't have the original art, but just having the color guide is, pretty impressive.
Yeah, with that piece, I remember when they advertised it in the comic book that you could send away for it, and I think I sent away for three of the posters, and 6 months went by, and finally it like showed up in the mail one day, and I had that hanging on my bedroom wall in high school, for like 5 or 6 years. I still have photographs. I can show you a scan of it of my bedroom from back then. You'll see all the superhero posters, the Perez Teen Titans poster, the John Byrne FF poster, the Byrne Alpha Flight poster, and the Michael Golden marching poster. But yeah, with that one, when the color guide came up at auction a couple of years ago, I know I probably paid top price for any color guide at the time, but I was like, yeah, if the original comes up for sale, it's gonna be out of my my wheelhouse, so I might as well go for this. And it's kind of cool to me because it's almost like having the poster on my wall again. It is hand colored by Golden, so that makes it actually extra special.
I didn't know he had done the coloring on that too.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really made me go all in on it. I was like, okay, Golden didn't color a lot of his stuff, from the early days, and if this is actually colored by him, then at least it's got some of his original art on it.
Right, right. Well, I mean, this is like prime Golden era too, as far as the work that I really like. I think that and there was that Marvel Omnibus or X-Men Omnibus kind of cover that had a bunch of Sentinels in the background that was around that same time period. But this is like,
yeah, the X-Men Chronicles.
Chronicles, that's it. Yeah, because I got that over on the shelf too. But that was, I think Zadok might have that piece, but it's just an amazing.
Yeah, I actually asked him last year to bring it to the art show that he was having in Manhattan. I was like, yeah, I would love to see that piece in person, and he brought it for me to see, and I was like, okay.
Did you get a picture of it?
I'm ever going to get to this piece,
You should. Did you get a picture of you holding the artwork? That's.
Yeah, no, I took pictures of it laying there. I was almost intimidated to like touch it, because it's a little oversized. It's bigger than 11 by 17, but beautiful in person. Not a single speck of whiteout on the entire piece. That's the thing about Golden that blows me away. Like even watching him drawing at shows now, like it's almost like he's tracing something invisible on the page. Like any other artist will go with pencil first, do a layout, get the structure down. He goes right in. I've only seen a few artists be able to do that. Kim Young Ji is another one that does that. Like they'll start anywhere on the page. Like traditionally, an artist usually starts with like the face or the eyes or something. These guys will start on like a finger and then just draw the body in perspective. Perfect every time. With Golden, that always blew me away. It's like you look at a piece like that X-Men Chronicles back cover, and it's like, how did he not use whiteout on that anywhere? Like I see a lot of artists, they actually use whiteout as like an accent. Like recent pieces I've bought from Alan Davis and Mark Farmer. Mark Farmer uses whiteout, as like action lines or as like splatters or stuff like that. And some of these other artists don't use it at all.
Right, right. No, I've seen that done before too. Just as, like you said, it's like an accent or a highlight, or
Mhm.
it's just like the guy who uses some kind of a rough edge to scuff up his artwork, like for movement or for
Yeah,
some
I
kind
was
of
I was just
action.
going to mention that John Romita Sr. does that a lot. If you look at any of his Spider-Man covers that have like black backgrounds, and he has like those dotted lines, like action lines. I've seen him, and also I asked Joe Giella about that because he was around the same time period, and Joe actually showed me how he did it at his studio. They put a layer of black ink down, then they take a razor blade and along a ruler, they just kind of pick it up as they go. And I've seen Terry Austin do this too on his pieces. It's like a cool little effect using a razor blade. Like the craziest tools, razor blades, toothbrushes. The craziest I've watched is like Bill Sienkiewicz. Have you ever watched him draw at shows?
A little bit, yeah.
Oh, he will use anything and everything. I've seen him use coffee from his cup, you know, spit. I mean,
There was an article I was just reading about original art put out by Jim McLaughlin on Newsarama, and talking about how really what was gold to Marvel after the fact was the stats, just the rolls and rolls of stats. That was what they would use for the reprints. They didn't go back to the original art. Once the original
okay,
art was done, they just that went in a closet. But the stats stayed around. So whenever they needed anything, they went to those and didn't go back to the art. So I mean, as an artist looking at it like that, knowing that the piece of paper really wasn't the thing that was going to be most important to to the guy employing you. I mean, they
mhm,
probably didn't care. They probably, there was a little bit of abandon to it. If I needed to make cut marks in it to get the effect I wanted when it was made into a stat,
right.
who cares, right? As long as it looks
Yeah,
right.
yeah, it was a different world back then. I mean, there was no aftermarket as far as like selling the pieces. I mean, because when the artists first started selling their art, I would guess in the 70s and 80s, I've heard stories of them selling pages for like $10 a piece, covers for 100 or less, so there wasn't a huge aftermarket for it. And original art was just something they gave away, at conventions or at the office, you know, plenty of stories of Stan Lee having, kids visiting the office, just giving them, hey, it's a free page, true believer, here you go. But yeah, that all changed now since it's getting like such high prices.
It's been a few years. I've been out of the convention circuit for a while. I mean, after
Mhm.
Big Wow sold and everything,
Yeah, I
uh,
missed that show big time.
I
That
know.
that that's one of my wife's like favorite shows that we went to, for a few years there. And just thinking back, like when I started going back to shows, like around 2002, 2004, around that time, and getting up 4 o'clock in the morning, waiting online, like outside. This was at like Heroes of Baltimore, where that's where I met like a lot of my collecting friends. We were the only idiots, lined up at like 5 o'clock in the morning in the dark, because we wanted to be first on Adam Hughes's sketch line or what have you, you know. And it's like, going to shows, getting no sleep, going out to parties, after that, it's like, how the heck did I do that?
No, no, I know. I did the same thing. I mean, especially for the Adam Hughes list back in,
Mhm.
2002, 2003. And I failed. I'd get on the list, but I'd be like 20th every time. And I never got anything. And it was a Heroes show where my wife was like, and it was, you know, his Father's Day. She's like, I'll go down, I'll be first in line, and I'll get on the list. And sure enough,
Mhm.
that's the only convention sketch I ever got from Madam Hughes was the one that she waited. And she probably was first in line at, you know, like 4 or 5 a.m. And where I had the kids in the strollers coming in, you know, like an hour later. And sure enough, she got it. So it's like she will. I will be forever in her debt for that.
You heard the story about the Mantis piece that I got from him?
Was it man? Well, you know, I thought you were going to tell me about the story about the Rogue piece that you had in your gallery that was folded in half. But
Well, the Rogue piece, that was one of the early conventions where I met him.
uh-huh.
I think it was 92. That was probably like the third or fourth time I'd met him, and went there with my ex, and she wound up getting Rogue from him. And it was one of those cases where at the time it was before Jim Lee was doing X-Men, so Rogue had like a couple of different outfits. So Adam's like, which outfit do you want? And she's like, you pick whatever you want. And he's like, okay, I'll pick something. So the whole time we were like standing off to the side waiting for him to finish drawing it, you know, because we didn't want to like hover over him. And he had the sketch pad up like this, and he keeps like looking up at us as he's drawing, and we're like, what the heck is he doing, right? So we go over there, and he wound up drawing the outfit that she was wearing on Rogue.
That
So I was
was
like,
so funny.
yeah, that's kind of clever. And then years later, she had moved to England, and this is when I was getting full time into like, you know, collecting art and stuff. And I was like, you know, do you still have that sketch? You know, she had that one, and she had a Dark Phoenix one. And I was like, you know, if you're not interested in them, you know, I'd be willing to buy them off of you. And she didn't know what happened to the Phoenix one, but the Rogue one was still at her mom's house. And then when she found it, she was like, "Oh yeah, my mom like folded it in half to like tuck it away somewhere." I was like, you know, but is what it is, you know. But no, the Mantis piece. This is when he was taking auctions on eBay for his sketches. He was only doing like two or three a show, and I won the one for I think it was Baltimore, and for whatever reason, it wasn't as expensive as some of the other ones. Like the ones for San Diego were, you know, $4,000 or more. People were bidding like crazy on those. The one that I won for Baltimore, I think it was a little over 2,000, so it was like half the price at the time. So you know, me and Adam are very close in age. Also, I think he was born like 2 or 3 weeks after I was. So I was like, oh, he probably grew up with like the same characters I did in the 70s. So I was like, can you draw Mantis from the Avengers? She was in the Avengers when I started reading the book. And he looked at me with like this blank stare, like, who? You know, like I have to remember that I started reading comics when I was like 5, whereas a lot of people didn't start till they were like 10 or so, you know. So he wasn't familiar with Mantis. He had no idea like how to draw her in like a nice pose or whatever. So he kept putting it off at the show. He's like, yeah, come by, you know, at the end of Sunday, I'll have something for you. And the show ends. He still hadn't drawn anything. So he's like, oh, we're going to the bar afterwards. Come by the bar. I'll draw it for you there. So we go out afterwards. And it was kind of cool because we got to have some drinks with him and Allison, and Bernie Wrightson stopped by with his wife as well. So it was like a cool experience. And Adam draws the picture for me. I'm thrilled. I go home. 3 days later, Allison emails me and says, "Yeah, Adam didn't like the piece he did for you. He wants to know if he can do it over." I was like, okay, like I'm fine with it. She's like, yeah, I think he did a great job too, but he's not happy with it. So lo and behold, like a month or two later, he did another piece, and it came out even more amazing. So
So are both pieces in your gallery?
he asked me not to post the first one because he wasn't happy with it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
because I said to him when he did the second piece, do you want me to
Send
send
it.
this one back to you? What do you want me to do with it? You know, I was trying to be fair to him.
Yeah.
He goes, no. He's like, I would like you to rip it up. He goes, I don't expect you to. He said, but do me a favor, don't post it. He goes, I'm not happy with it. You know, I don't want it viewed. So
Right.
I was like,
Oh.
that's fine. You know.
So you've got two mantises from Adam Hughes. I mean, no one else can say that, Rich. Not a soul.
I don't know if anybody else wants to say they have two Mantis sketches, but I'm the one, right?
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. No, well, I'm looking at it now. It is beautiful, the one you have posted in your gallery. That's great.
Yeah, it was funny. Someone just emailed me, I would say within the last week, wanting to know if I have a part with that piece. And I kind of laughed because I'm like, do you know what I had to go through to get this piece? You know, between driving to Baltimore, hanging around, you know, driving back, and you know, it's just a lot of times it's not even the art; it's like the story behind how you got it. You know,
Oh yeah,
you don't,
your
you know,
experience.
yeah, like people have asked me about the Captain America piece that Gene Colan drew for me. You know, when I first met him, and it's like there's no way I could ever part with that piece. You know,
Hmm.
not that it's the most expensive piece on the face of the earth, but to me, it's so personalized. You know, of the experience of meeting him for the first time, sitting with him. You know, like he literally invited me behind the table, like, "Oh, sit next to me while I draw this," and you're just in awe, you know.
Right.
So certain pieces we'll never part with.
No, I have a few of those myself. But yeah, no, that's fantastic. Um, wow. Well, Rich, I probably should end it here,
Yes,
but we could probably keep talking. I mean, I don't, it's but like I said, I got to get out to a party this evening.
not a
So
problem, man. I appreciate all your time,
no,
and
no.
and like I said, I appreciate all you do with your website.
Well, no, I trust me. If it wasn't for guys like you and so many other collectors that have used the site over the years, I mean, CAF wouldn't be what it is. So I know, uh, we there's a lot more things that we've got planned for the site really in the next couple of years. Hopefully, we can
Awesome.
pull them all off and make it actually better than it is today. Uh, but I appreciate you taking the time today so that we could talk about your
Anytime, man.
collection.
It's been a
Yeah,
pleasure.
awesome.